Hello and welcome in that new video in which I will show you how I created my Catwoman costume. For me, in the DC universe, there are only two real Catwoman, and it's the original one from the animated series, and then it is the Tim Burton's Catwoman. So that's the one I wanted to reproduce. I realized with this costume that cosplay is not something that I will be very into. I really love to watch cosplayers. It's amazing the thing that they do. But I personally prefer to create costume from scratch rather than to reproduce something that already exists. So this Catwoman cosplay costume is going to be my only cosplay, I think. And with no further ado, let's go to the video. And we jump right into the sewing of the stitches because I didn't feel the beginning of the making of the costume. I first had to create a muslin to make sure the pattern I chose fit me. Then I sewed the back and front together at the inner leg. And after that, I sewed strips of fabric onto the bodysuit and stitched them with DMC cotton. Here you can see me adding straps of fabric directly on the mannequin to make sure they were placed correctly, and then that led to more sewing and more stitching, which is actually the part that I love the most. The sewing was sometimes difficult because of the stretchiness of the fabric, but the stitching, that was awesome. That was fun, that was relaxing. I really loved it. And at that stage, the bodysuit is almost done. The only thing that was missing was the zipper and the stitches of the chest. And to make sure that these stitches were placed perfectly, I traced them directly on me using tape. Here is the result. The bodysuit is done. Now it is time to move on to the corset. First, I prepared the pattern using one that I had bought a couple of years ago. I copied it onto pattern paper, then I cut it across the waist to add 4 centimeters as it was too short for me. And once that was done, I could move on to sewing the first muslin. Here you can see the new seams marked with tape. Catwoman's corset has seams that go from under the armholes to the front of the bodice. Because I didn't have a similar pattern, I used a classic corset pattern. Then when I was happy with the fit, I marked the new seams and took that part apart to create the final pattern pieces. I started by making the lining like that. If something went wrong and needed to be adjusted, I would still be able to do it before sewing the final fabric. If fabric had to be wasted, I wanted it to be cotton because it's easier to buy. I ironed interfacing as well onto the fabric to make the corset as sturdy as possible before sewing everything together. I repeated the same process with heavy wet cotton and the custom fabric. I wanted to add an extra layer and sew both layers together in order to prevent the costume fabric from stretching too much. After sewing the corset pieces together, I sewed the boning channels, and now it is finally time for my favorite activity, the stitching. What about we enjoy that at real speed for a while? Back to the mannequin to mark hips boning, placing and sewing the strips of fabric onto the corset before stitching them around the boning. To finish the corset, I sewed the lining and the final fabric together, placed the eyelets, and hand sewn a long strip of fabric to make a ribbon. Now that the corset is done, I can move on to the cowl. This is the mask I got after wrapping duct tape around my head. Here you can see me cutting it into several parts to make the pattern. Then I cut each pieces twice into EVA foam and I glued them together to make the base of the cowl. Here is how it looked like at first. I had to make a couple of adjustments before I could sew the fabric onto it, and covering the foam with the fabric was the most challenging part of the costume. I wanted to stick to the original design as much as possible, but I also had to avoid the fabric from wrinkling. It took me a lot of tries, and the back of it doesn't look much like the original cowl, but it was good enough. And then came my favorite part, the stitching. Fun and relaxing activity that I could do sitting on my sofa, watching a series, and sometimes having the visit of my cat. Looking at it on the mannequin head, it seems that it is way too big, but I have very long hair I need to tuck under it, so when I wear it, it looks fine. I added later on some fabric below the cowl to make sure that my neck will not be seen. Now it is time to move on to the gloves and the nails. The gloves were the easiest costume part to make. All I needed to do was trace the shape of my hand, cut the fabric, sew it, and voila. But now that I think about it, it might not have been that easy after all. The fabric is so stretchy that I had to pass several times around the fingers because some stitches were skipped. And when I say some stitches, I mean a lot of stitches. Gloves done, and now it's time to embellish them with beautiful Catwoman nails. I decided to use EVA foam for the sharp and pointy ends, as I didn't want to use any material that would damage the fabric if I wasn't careful. Catwoman has very interesting nails. They have bolts on it and other stuff of the sort, which I wanted to add, but I didn't want to go to the hardware store, so I made little springs with wires. I glued the EVA foam and the springs onto thimbles. I tried to vary the design as much as possible to keep it interesting. And lastly, I covered everything roughly with foam clay in order to make sure everything would stick together. And here are my cute nails. Then I painted everything with several layers of silver paint, and after that I applied some brown wash to make them look a little bit older and dirtier as well. The nails look great, I love them, that is my favorite part of the costume, and now that they are done and looking awesome, I can move on to the last part, the shoes. I had a pair of faux leather boots that were so old the material started to peel off. Rather than throw them away, I decided to cover them with my costume fabric. I cut them down because they were over the knee boots and I wanted them to be below the knee. Then I removed as much of the faux leather as possible. Once the base was clean, I used a piece of stretchy fabric to create a pattern, though I didn't really follow it later on. I glued the fabric onto the boots and hand sewed it around the zipper and at the top. Then I added the tongue and the lacing, and the boots were done. Unfortunately, I didn't know that I was wasting my time because the soles fell apart after I went on a photo shoot with a friend. So I had to order a new pair of boots when I got back home. Anyway, here is the final result. Thank you to my friend Irena for taking the pictures.